February 1942. Allied commanders burst into laughter when American ships arrived at the front lines carrying thousands of bottles of Coca-Cola alongside ammunition and medical supplies, calling it the most ridiculous waste of warship space they'd ever witnessed. But when German prisoners of war began surrendering specifically to get their hands on that American liquid gold, and Japanese captives started questioning everything they'd been told about Western weakness, those same commanders stopped laughing. What did enemy soldiers discover in a simple bottle of Coke that completely shattered their belief in their own superiority? The winter of 1942 was cruel to Europe. Snow fell on empty shops and broken windows. People stood in long lines for a piece of bread or a cup of milk. Children had forgotten what candy tasted like. Even the soldiers fighting for freedom had empty stomachs most days. In London, British generals gathered around wooden tables covered with maps. Their faces looked tired and worried. Teacups sat cold and forgotten as they talked about the war. Outside, bombs had left holes in the streets. Inside, the men who led armies wore thick coats because there was no coal for heat. General Montgomery pulled his coat tighter and shook his head at the papers in front of him. Food was so hard to find that soldiers got one small can of meat every 3 days. Sugar was like gold. Coffee was a dream from before the war. The British people had learned to make tea from old leaves used 3 times already. Across the English Channel in France, German soldiers were just as hungry. Their black bread was made with sawdust to make it last longer. Their coffee was made from burned grain that tasted like dirt. Both sides of the war knew what it meant to go without. Then the Americans came. The first thing that shocked the British was not the tanks or the guns. It was the smell. When American ships opened their doors, the smell of real coffee floated out like a warm cloud. British soldiers standing on the docks breathed in deep and remembered what they had lost. But what came next made them laugh out loud. Soldiers in green uniforms started carrying wooden boxes off the ships. The boxes were heavy, and the Americans treated them like they held gold. British dock workers crowded around to see what treasures these Americans brought to win the war. When the first box opened, British soldiers burst into laughter that echoed across the harbor. Bottles. Hundreds of brown glass bottles filled with dark, fizzy liquid. Each bottle had red and white letters that spelled Coca-Cola. "Are you having a joke with us?" asked Sergeant Williams, a British soldier who had not smiled in 6 months. He picked up one of the bottles and held it up to the gray London sky. The liquid inside was darker than tea, but lighter than coffee. The American soldier, Private Johnson from Georgia, grinned wide. "No joke, mate. This here is the most important thing we brought." The British soldiers laughed even harder. Here they were, fighting the biggest war in history, and the Americans brought soda pop. Not extra bullets, not warm blankets, not medicine, fizzy drinks. "You crossed an ocean full of German submarines," said Captain Roberts, wiping tears from his eyes, "to bring us children's drinks?" More boxes opened. More bottles appeared. Thousands of them. Then tens of thousands. The American soldiers treated each bottle like it was precious. They counted them. They organized them in perfect rows. They built special wooden shelves to hold them off the ground. General Montgomery himself came to see what was causing all the noise at the docks. When he saw the mountains of Coca-Cola bottles, he rubbed his forehead like he had a headache. "Gentlemen," he said to the American officers, "we are fighting for the future of the free world. Our men are dying for want of ammunition. Our people are starving. And you bring us soft drinks?" Colonel Mitchell, who had come from America to organize the Coca-Cola operation, stood straight and serious. Sir, with respect, this is ammunition, just a different kind. The British general's eyebrows went up. Around him, British soldiers were still chuckling and shaking their heads. Some picked up the bottles to read the strange writing. Others pretended to drink from them and made silly faces. But Colonel Mitchell did not smile. He looked at the bottles like they were weapons. He talked about them like they were battle plans. He had charts and graphs showing where each bottle would go. He had maps with red pins showing every place Coca-Cola needed to be delivered. In America, Colonel Mitchell explained, our boys drink this every day. It reminds them of home. It gives them hope. It makes them remember what they are fighting for. The British soldiers looked at each other and tried not to laugh again. Fighting for fizzy drinks? It seemed like the strangest thing they had ever heard. General Montgomery picked up a bottle and looked at it closely. The glass was smooth and clean. The liquid inside bubbled like it was alive. The label was bright red and white, colors that seemed to glow even in the gray London light. "And you believe," the general said slowly, "that this drink will help us win the war?" "I believe," said Colonel Mitchell, "that you will understand soon enough." As the American colonel spoke, more ships arrived at the harbor. Each one carried the same cargo. Thousands more bottles. Millions more bottles. The Americans had crossed a dangerous ocean, past enemy submarines and through terrible storms to bring Coca-Cola to the war. The British soldiers stopped laughing when they realized how serious the Americans were. This was not a joke. This was a real military operation. Someone important had decided that these bottles were worth the risk of ships and lives. But they still did not understand why. How could a sweet drink help win a war? How could something so simple matter so much? The questions hung in the cold air like fog, waiting for answers that would come sooner than anyone expected. The first bottle opened with a sharp hiss that cut through the quiet morning air. Private Johnson from Georgia twisted off the metal cap and handed the brown bottle to Sergeant Williams. The British soldier looked at it like it might explode in his hands. "Go on, then," Johnson said with a grin. "Take a sip." Williams brought the bottle to his lips. The liquid was cold, colder than anything he had tasted in months. It hit his tongue with a sharp, sweet bite that made his eyes water. Bubbles danced in his mouth and tickled his nose. He swallowed and felt the fizz slide down his throat. For 10 seconds, Williams said nothing. He just stood there holding the bottle, blinking in surprise. Then his face changed. The hard lines around his eyes softened. His shoulders dropped like a heavy weight had been lifted off them. "Bloody hell," he whispered. "It tastes like happiness." Within an hour, word spread through the British camp like wildfire. The Americans had brought something that could make you forget the war for just a moment. Something that could make you remember what it felt like to be happy. British soldiers who had not smiled in months started appearing at the American tents. They came with curious eyes and empty hands, hoping for just one taste of this strange American drink. The Americans shared freely, opening bottle after bottle with loud pops that sounded like tiny celebrations. The change was immediate and shocking. British soldiers, who had been walking around like ghosts, suddenly stood straighter. They talked louder. They laughed at jokes that were not even funny. Some started whistling songs they had not sung since before the war began. Captain Roberts watched his men from across the camp and shook his head in wonder. "It is like watching dead men come back to life," he told another officer. But the real surprise came 3 days later when the first German prisoners arrived. The truck rolled into camp covered in mud and carrying 12 German soldiers who had surrendered near the French coast. They climbed out slowly, their gray uniforms torn and dirty. Their faces were thin from hunger. Their eyes looked hollow and defeated. The American guards lined them up and began checking their papers. Standard procedure called for a search, then a meal, then questions. But Private Johnson had a different idea. He walked up to the first German prisoner, a young man who could not have been older than 20. The prisoner's hands shook as he held them up in surrender. Johnson reached into his jacket and pulled out a cold bottle of Coca-Cola. The prisoner's eyes went wide. He had heard stories about American torture methods. He prepared himself for pain. Instead, Johnson twisted off the cap and held out the bottle. "Here you go, son," Johnson said in his slow Georgia accent. "You look thirsty." The German prisoner stared at the bottle like it was a trick. He looked at the other guards. He looked at the American officer standing nearby. Everyone was watching him, but no one looked angry or mean. With shaking hands, he took the bottle. He brought it to his nose and smelled the sweet, sharp scent. Then he drank. The taste hit him like a physical blow. His knees almost buckled. Tears filled his eyes and ran down his dirty cheeks. He had not tasted anything sweet in 8 months. He had forgotten that food could be something other than survival. "Mein Gott," he whispered in German. "My God." The other German prisoners watched in amazement as their friend cried over a bottle of soda. One by one, they each received their own bottle. One by one, they experienced the same shock of sweetness and abundance. But the real moment of understanding came when the prisoners realized this was not special treatment. This was normal. The Americans gave Coca-Cola to everyone, to their own soldiers, to British allies, to French civilians, even to German enemies. Hans Mueller, a German sergeant who spoke some English, finally found his voice. "This drink," he said carefully. "Your soldiers have this every day?" "Every day they want it," Johnson replied. "Back home, you can buy one for 5 cents at any store in any town." The German prisoners looked at each other with expressions of complete confusion. 5 cents? Any store? Any town? In Germany, sugar had disappeared from shops 2 years ago. Coffee was a memory. Even water was sometimes hard to find. "How many bottles does America make?" asked another prisoner. "Millions," Johnson said simply. "Millions every day." The number hit the German soldiers like a physical force. Millions of bottles, every day. While their own country struggled to make enough bullets, America was making millions of bottles of sweet drink just because people enjoyed it. Over the following days, more prisoners arrived. From Italy, from France, from North Africa. Each group received the same treatment: food, water, medical care, and a cold bottle of Coca-Cola. The British soldiers watched this ritual and began to understand something important. The Americans were not just being kind. They were making a statement. They were showing their enemies what America could do. The Italian prisoners were the first to put it into words. "If they can make this much of something they do not need," said Private Rossi, "how much can they make of things they do need?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. How many tanks could a country make if it was already making millions of bottles for fun? How many planes could they build? How many bullets? How many ships? The German prisoners started asking for American newspapers. They wanted to see pictures of American cities. They wanted to know about American factories. They had been told that America was weak and soft, but nothing weak could create this kind of abundance. Late at night, when the guards were not watching closely, the prisoners talked among themselves in quiet voices. They talked about the taste of Coca-Cola. They talked about American kindness. They talked about what it meant that their enemies could waste ships and fuel to bring happiness to a war zone. And slowly, quietly, they began to understand that they might be fighting for the wrong side. The breaking point came on Christmas morning, 1942. Klaus Weber had been a German prisoner for 3 weeks. Every morning, he woke up expecting cruelty. Every morning, he received kindness instead. The American guards brought him hot coffee, warm bread, and always, always, a cold bottle of Coca-Cola with his breakfast. This Christmas morning felt different. Snow fell softly outside the prison camp windows. Klaus could hear American soldiers singing Christmas carols in the distance. Their voices carried joy that he had not heard in years, not since before the war stole everything good from the world. Private Johnson appeared at Klaus's cell door, carrying a wooden tray. On it sat the usual breakfast, but something extra caught Klaus's eye. A small piece of chocolate cake with white frosting. Real sugar frosting that sparkled in the morning light. "Merry Christmas, Klaus," Johnson said in his gentle southern voice. He set the tray down and pulled up a chair outside the cell bars. "Mind if I sit with you while you eat?" Klaus stared at the cake. In Germany, he had not seen real sugar in 2 years. Children had forgotten what cake tasted like. His own mother had sold her wedding ring to buy flour for bread. Yet here sat a piece of cake, given freely to an enemy soldier on Christmas morning. "Why?" Klaus asked in broken English. "Why do you give this to me?" Johnson tilted his head, like he did not understand the question. "It is Christmas, son. Nobody should be alone on Christmas." Klaus picked up the fork with shaking hands. The cake was soft and sweet and perfect. The frosting melted on his tongue like snow made of sugar. He ate slowly, trying to make each bite last forever. Tears ran down his face and dropped onto the white frosting. "Tell me about your home," Johnson said quietly. "Tell me about Germany before the war." For the first time in months, Klaus talked about good things. He talked about his village bakery where his father made bread every morning. He talked about Sunday walks with his girlfriend Anna. He talked about Christmas markets filled with warm lights and happy people. As he spoke, Klaus realized something terrible. The Germany he loved was gone. The war had taken his father's bakery. It had taken Anna, who died in a bombing raid. It had taken the Christmas markets and the happy people and everything worth fighting for. "What are we fighting for?" Klaus whispered, more to himself than to Johnson. Johnson was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached through the bars and handed Klaus another bottle of Coca-Cola. "That is something every man has to figure out for himself." The sound of the bottle opening seemed louder than usual in the quiet cell. Klaus drank slowly, feeling the familiar fizz and sweetness. But now, it tasted different. It did not just taste like happiness anymore. It tasted like a question he was afraid to answer. That afternoon, Klaus met Heinrich, a German officer who had been captured the week before. Heinrich was older, smarter, and angrier than most prisoners. He still believed in the war. He still believed Germany would win. His uniform was torn, but he wore it like armor. His eyes burned with the fire of a true believer. "They are trying to make us soft," Heinrich warned the other prisoners during their exercise time in the yard. "The cake, the drinks, the kindness. It is all a trick to make us forget who we are." The other German prisoners gathered around Heinrich like he was giving a sermon. They wanted to believe him. They wanted to believe that their capture was part of some larger plan, that their suffering had meaning, that their cause was still just. "Remember," Heinrich continued, his voice getting stronger. "We are the master race. We are superior. These Americans with their silly drinks and their soft hearts will learn what real strength looks like when the fatherland rises again." But Klaus was not listening to Heinrich anymore. He was watching the American guards. They stood quietly at the edges of the yard, not stopping the German officer from speaking. In Germany, anyone who spoke against the government would be shot. Here, the Americans let their enemies say whatever they wanted. Klaus was thinking about something else, too. If America could give cake and Coca-Cola to enemy prisoners on Christmas, what did they give to their own people? If this was how they treated enemies, how did they treat friends? The answer came 3 days later when Klaus was assigned to work in the camp kitchen. The American cook, Sergeant Martinez, was a short, happy man from New Mexico who hummed while he worked. He showed Klaus around like they were old friends instead of enemy soldiers. "Come on, amigo," Martinez said with a grin. "Let me show you where we keep the good stuff." He led Klaus to the storage rooms where they kept food for the prisoners. Klaus stopped breathing when the first door opened. The rooms were filled with more food than his entire village had seen in 2 years. Boxes of coffee stacked to the ceiling like brown towers, bags of sugar piled like white mountains that seemed to glow in the electric light, cans of meat, vegetables, and fruit covering every shelf from floor to ceiling. And in one corner, cases and cases of Coca-Cola bottles, more than Klaus could count, even if he tried all day. The smell hit him like a physical force. Real coffee. Real sugar. Canned peaches that smelled like summer. His stomach growled so loud that Martinez laughed. "This is just for the prisoners?" Klaus asked in amazement, his voice barely a whisper. Martinez laughed again and slapped Klaus on the shoulder. "Son, this is nothing. You should see what we got for our own boys. And back home, every grocery store in every little town has 10 times this much food. People buy whatever they want, whenever they want it." Klaus leaned against the wall because his legs felt weak. 10 times this much food? In every town? His own village had one small store that was empty most days. People traded cigarettes for bread. Children fought over apple cores. "But how?" Klaus asked. "How do you have so much?" Martinez shrugged like it was the simplest thing in the world. "We make it, we grow it, we share it. That's what free people do." That evening, Klaus sat in his cell with his dinner tray and tried to understand what he had seen. The tray held more food than many German families ate in a week. Roast beef that was actually tender. Mashed potatoes made with real butter. Green beans that were not wilted or rotten. Fresh bread that was still warm. And of course, a cold bottle of Coca-Cola that opened with its familiar cheerful hiss. He ate slowly, tasting each bite. The meat was seasoned with spices he had forgotten existed. The butter was rich and yellow like sunshine. Even the green beans tasted better than anything he had eaten in months. Outside his window, American soldiers walked past carrying their own dinner trays back to their barracks. They were laughing and talking about a baseball game they had heard on the radio. They carried bottles of Coca-Cola like other soldiers carried rifles. Normal. Every day. Expected. That night, Klaus lay on his clean bed in his warm cell and stared at the ceiling. The mattress was softer than his bed at home had ever been. The blanket was thick and new and smelled like soap instead of sweat and fear. Through the window, he could see American guards walking their rounds, and each one carried a bottle of Coca-Cola like it was the most normal thing in the world. Heinrich came to his cell window around midnight. His face was pressed against the bars, and his eyes looked wild in the darkness. "You are thinking too much," the older officer hissed. I can see it in your face. Remember what they taught us. Americans are weak. They are soft. They have no fighting spirit. Klaus sat up and looked at Heinrich through the darkness. The older man's uniform was still perfectly pressed, despite their weeks in prison. He still clicked his heels when he walked. He still believed every word their leaders had told them. If they are so weak, Klaus said slowly, why do they have so much? If they are so soft, why are we in prison and they are free? If they have no fighting spirit, why are they winning the war? Heinrich's face twisted with anger. His hands gripped the bars until his knuckles turned white. You are starting to sound like them. You are forgetting your duty to the fatherland. You are becoming a traitor to everything we fought for. But Klaus was not forgetting. He was remembering. He was remembering what his father had told him before the war began, back when the world still made sense. A man's worth is not measured by how much he can take, but by how much he can give. The Americans gave cake to their enemies. They gave Coca-Cola to prisoners who had tried to kill them. They shared their abundance with people who hated them. They treated captured soldiers better than Germany treated its own citizens. If this was weakness, Klaus thought, then maybe weakness was stronger than strength. Heinrich turned away from the window in disgust. You are lost, he said, but I will not give up. I will never stop believing in the righteous cause of our people. As Heinrich's footsteps faded down the corridor, Klaus opened his evening bottle of Coca-Cola. The sound echoed in the quiet cell like a tiny celebration. He drank slowly and thought about righteous causes and what they really meant. The final moment of understanding came 1 week later during a visit from an American Red Cross worker. The woman, Mrs. Patterson, was older with gray hair and kind eyes behind wire glasses. She brought packages from home for the American soldiers, arriving in a truck loaded with boxes wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Klaus watched through his cell window as she handed out letters, photographs, and small gifts to the soldiers. Each package was opened with excitement and joy. Men who fought in the most terrible war in history acted like children on Christmas morning when they got letters from home. But what shocked Klaus most was what happened next. Mrs. Patterson had extra packages. Instead of loading them back into her truck, she asked the guards to give them to the German prisoners. Packages meant for American heroes, given freely to German enemies. Every person deserves to know someone cares about them, Klaus heard her tell the camp commander through his open window. Even if they are on the wrong side. An hour later, Klaus received a package meant for an American soldier named Tommy from Kansas. Inside was a letter from Tommy's mother, a photograph of a family farm with green fields stretching to the horizon, homemade cookies wrapped in wax paper, and 2 bottles of Coca-Cola packed carefully in tissue. The letter was not meant for him, but Klaus read it anyway. Tommy's mother wrote about the corn harvest being good this year. She wrote about Klaus's little sister starting school. She wrote about the church social and Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning apple pie. She wrote about hoping Tommy was safe and warm and not too homesick. It painted a picture of a country where people worried about ordinary things like weather and crops, and school plays instead of bombs and death, and which race was superior. A place where mothers sent cookies to sons and worried about them being homesick, rather than whether they were killing enough enemies. This was what Americans were fighting for. Not conquest or glory or empire or racial purity. They were fighting to protect corn harvests and school plays and church socials and the right to drink Coca-Cola whenever they wanted. They were fighting to keep being ordinary, happy, free people. Klaus ate one of Tommy's mother's cookies. It was sweet and buttery, and made with real vanilla. It tasted like love. He wondered if his own mother was still alive, still trying to bake bread with sawdust flour in their cold, empty house. That night, Klaus wrote his first letter to his sister back in Germany. He could not tell her about the abundance, or the kindness, or the cake. The German censors would never allow such dangerous words to reach home. But he could tell her something else. He wrote carefully, knowing every word would be read by suspicious eyes. Dear Greta, I am safe and well treated. The Americans are not what we were told. I am learning that there are different kinds of strength in this world. Some strength destroys, some strength builds. I think I have been serving the wrong kind. Your brother, Klaus. As he finished writing, Klaus opened his evening bottle of Coca-Cola. The hiss of escaping gas sounded different now. It did not just sound like happiness or abundance anymore. It sounded like truth cutting through lies. It sounded like freedom calling his name. The train wheels clicked against the tracks like a broken clock as Klaus Weber crossed the border into Germany in May 1945. The war was over. Hitler was dead. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and left nothing but ruins and shame. Klaus pressed his face against the dirty window and watched his homeland roll past. Where once stood proud cities, now only broken walls reached toward the gray sky like fingers of dead men. Factories that had made weapons of war were twisted metal graveyards. Houses where families had lived were piles of brick and memories. The train car smelled like unwashed bodies, fear, and defeat. 43 German prisoners sat in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about what he would find at home. Some stared at their hands. Others slept fitfully against the hard wooden seats. A few wept quietly, thinking no one could see their tears. But it was the people outside that shocked Klaus most. German civilians walked along the roads, carrying everything they owned in small bundles tied with rope. Their clothes were torn and dirty, patched with scraps of fabric from curtains and tablecloths. Their faces were thin from hunger, cheekbones sharp as knife edges. Children who should have been playing looked like old men with tired eyes and hollow cheeks that spoke of months without proper food. Klaus reached into his coat pocket and touched the 2 bottles of Coca-Cola he had saved from his last day in the American prison camp. Private Johnson had pressed them into his hands during their goodbye, along with a photograph of Johnson's farm in Georgia, and a small bag of peppermint candy for Klaus's sister's children. Remember what you learned here, Johnson had said, his voice thick with emotion. Remember that there's always another way to be strong. The bottles were warm now from Klaus's body heat, but they were real. They were proof that what he had experienced was not a dream born from hunger and desperation. The labels were still bright red and white, colors that seemed impossible in this gray world of defeat and destruction. The train stopped at a small station near his village, with a screech of brakes and a cloud of steam. Klaus climbed down onto the platform with the other returning prisoners, his legs weak from the long journey. Around him, men who had marched off to conquer the world now shuffled home in defeat. Their uniforms were gray rags held together with string and hope. Their boots had holes that let in the cold spring rain. Their proud Nazi badges were nowhere to be seen, thrown away, or buried in shame. Klaus began the long walk home through countryside he barely recognized. The road was broken in places where tanks had passed. Shell holes filled with dirty water reflected the cloudy sky like dead eyes. Fields that should have been green with spring crops were brown and empty, littered with pieces of metal that might once have been planes or trucks or weapons. Barns that should have been full of animals stood open and hollow, their doors hanging broken on twisted hinges. Even the trees looked sick, their leaves small and yellow like they were dying from some invisible disease. The air itself seemed tired, heavy with the weight of too much suffering. When he reached his village, Klaus stopped walking and stared in disbelief. Half the buildings were gone, not just damaged, but completely erased, as if they had never existed. The church where he had been married was a pile of stones arranged in the rough shape of what once had been. The bakery where his father had made bread every morning before dawn was a black hole in the ground, still smelling faintly of smoke, 2 months after the bombing. The school where children had learned to love their fatherland and hate their enemies was missing its roof and 3 walls. Inside, Klaus could see small wooden desks scattered like broken toys, some still holding children's notebooks with lessons about racial superiority and the glory of war. The irony was not lost on him. The town square where people had gathered to cheer for Hitler was now a crater filled with dirty water and debris. The statue of some forgotten German hero lay in pieces, its bronze head staring sightlessly at the ruined sky. Klaus found his house at the end of what used to be Elm Street. The front wall was gone, blown away by artillery fire that had left the interior exposed like a dollhouse opened for play. Inside, he could see his mother's kitchen table, still standing but covered with debris, broken plaster, and stains from months of rain damage. His childhood bedroom was open to the sky, his old books and toys scattered and ruined by weather and war. His sister Greta was living in the basement with her 2 children and an elderly neighbor woman whose own house had been completely destroyed. When Klaus climbed down the wooden steps that creaked under his weight, she looked up from a pot of thin soup made from turnips and grass, and screamed with joy that echoed off the stone walls. She had thought he was dead for 2 years. The last letter she had received was from somewhere in France, just before his unit was captured. After that, only silence and worry and the slow death of hope. "Klaus, mein Bruder," she cried, throwing her thin arms around him. "You are so thin, but you are alive. You are alive and home." Klaus hugged her back and felt how light she had become. Her body was all sharp angles and prominent bones. Her dress, once fitted and pretty, hung loose on her small frame like clothing made for someone twice her size. Her hair, once thick and blonde like spun gold, was thin and gray at 25 years old, aged by worry and malnutrition. Her children, his nephew and niece, stared at him with big eyes from faces that had forgotten what it meant to smile. The boy, Peter, was 8 but looked younger, his growth stunted by poor food. The girl, little Anna, was 6 and clung to her mother's skirt like she was afraid this stranger might disappear like so many other people had disappeared. The basement was cold and damp, lit by a single candle that cast dancing shadows on the walls. In one corner sat a small pile of belongings that represented everything the family had left in the world. A few pieces of clothing, some kitchen pots, a Bible with water-damaged pages, a photograph of their parents, both dead now from disease and despair. "I brought you something," Klaus said softly, his voice trembling with emotion. He reached into his coat with careful hands and pulled out the 2 bottles of Coca-Cola. Greta stared at the bottles like they had fallen from another world, from some impossible place where such things could still exist. Her hands shook as she reached out to touch one, as if it might disappear at her touch. "Where did you get these?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "These do not exist anymore. Not here. Not anywhere in Germany. I have not seen one in 3 years. Klaus twisted off the first cap with his thumb. A skill he had learned from watching American soldiers. The familiar hiss filled the basement like music from heaven. The sweet smell made the children step closer with wonder in their eyes, drawn by something they had never experienced, but somehow knew was good. He handed the bottle to his nephew first, the boy who had been born into war and known nothing but scarcity and fear. Peter took it with trembling hands and brought it to his lips. The first taste hit him like a physical shock. His eyes grew wide with amazement. His mouth dropped open in surprise. He had never tasted anything sweeter than tree bark or grass soup. The child drank carefully, making each sip last as long as possible. Then he passed the bottle to his little sister, who giggled when the bubbles tickled her nose and made her sneeze. The sound of children laughing in that dark basement was like hearing angels sing. Then Greta tasted it, and tears ran down her thin cheeks as she remembered what happiness used to feel like. The sweetness brought back memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings, and all the simple joys that war had stolen from their lives. "Tell me," Greta said, as they shared the precious liquid, passing the bottle back and forth like a sacred ritual. "Tell me where you have been. Tell me what happened to you. Tell me how you got these impossible things." So Klaus told her everything. He told her about the American prison camp that was cleaner and warmer than most German homes had been even before the war. He told her about Private Johnson and his gentle Southern voice that spoke of kindness instead of cruelty. He told her about Christmas cake made with real sugar and real flour, food so rich it made prisoners cry. He told her about storage rooms full of more food than their entire village had seen in 5 years, about coffee that smelled like heaven, and bread that was soft and white. About meat that was not just edible, but delicious, seasoned with spices that had become legends in hungry Germany. But mostly, he told her about Coca-Cola, how every prisoner received a bottle every single day, as regular as sunrise. How American soldiers drank it like water, never thinking about how precious it was. How Mrs. Patterson, the Red Cross woman, gave away packages meant for heroes to German prisoners who had tried to kill those same heroes. "They had so much," Klaus said, his voice full of wonder even now, months later. "So much food, so much kindness, so much abundance that they could afford to be generous to people who hated them. They fed us better than our own army ever fed us. They gave us warm beds while German soldiers slept in mud. They treated us like human beings when we had been taught to see them as less than animals." Greta listened in silence, occasionally sipping from the second bottle of Coca-Cola, making it last as long as possible. Outside their basement refuge, they could hear other villagers arguing over scraps of food and pieces of coal. Inside their small sanctuary, brother and sister shared a drink that tasted like hope made liquid. The old woman, Frau Mueller, who had been silent until now, spoke up in a voice cracked with age and sorrow. "My grandson was at Stalingrad. Before he died, he wrote that Russian prisoners were given nothing but bread and water. Sometimes, not even that. He said it made him ashamed to be German." "But Klaus," Greta said finally, setting down the bottle with great care, "if the Americans are so rich, so kind, so powerful, then why did we fight them? Why did our leaders tell us they were weak and evil? Why did they say Americans were cowards who would run at the first sign of real battle?" Klaus was quiet for a long time, staring at the candle flame that flickered in the damp air. He had asked himself the same question every day since Christmas morning in the prison camp when Private Johnson had given him cake and sat with him while he ate. The answer was painful, but clear as mountain water. Because, he said slowly, choosing each word with care, our leaders knew the truth. They knew that if German people saw American abundance, American kindness, American freedom, we would stop following them. We would stop believing their lies about superiority and master races and righteous wars. We would start asking why we lived like prisoners while our enemies lived like kings. He took the bottle from Greta and held it up to the dim light filtering through the small basement window. The brown liquid seemed to glow with its own inner light, like it contained some kind of magic. This bottle, Klaus continued, is not just a drink. It is proof that there is a different way to live, a way where people make things that bring joy instead of things that bring death, a way where strength means helping others instead of hurting them, a way where being powerful means you can afford to be kind to your enemies instead of cruel to your friends. Greta nodded slowly, her thin face serious in the candlelight. And that is why they were winning the war, even when we thought we were stronger. Yes, Klaus said, his voice firm with conviction. We were fighting to destroy. They were fighting to protect. We were fighting to take. They were fighting to give. We were fighting because we were told to hate. They were fighting because they chose to love what they had built. How could we ever win against that? Little Anna, who had been quiet through the whole conversation, suddenly spoke up in her small voice. Uncle Klaus, will the Americans come here? Will they bring more of the happy water? Klaus smiled and picked up his niece, feeling how light she was, like a bird made of hollow bones. I think they will, little one. I think they will come to help us learn how to be strong in a new way. Over the following weeks, Klaus helped his sister and her children rebuild their life in the ruins. It was hard work with little food and no money, but Klaus found that he could work with hope now instead of just desperation. He had seen that there was something better than this gray existence of survival and scarcity. He had tasted proof that the world could be kind as well as cruel, abundant as well as empty. Other returning prisoners came to visit Klaus after hearing about his stories of American abundance. They climbed down into the basement and sat on wooden crates and broken chairs, listening as he described storage rooms full of food and soldiers who shared their drinks with enemies. Some believed him and nodded with understanding. Others thought he was lying or had gone crazy from his time in captivity. But Heinrich, the proud officer who had warned against American softness and preached about German superiority, was not among the visitors. Klaus heard from other prisoners that Heinrich had returned home to find his wife and children dead from disease, his house burned to ash, and his city nothing but rubble and graves. Unable to accept that everything he had believed was wrong, that his sacrifices had been for nothing, that his hatred had been built on lies, Heinrich had walked into the forest one cold night in June and never come back. Some said he had hanged himself from an oak tree. Others said he had simply wandered deeper and deeper into the woods until he became lost and died of exposure. Either way, he had chosen death over the painful work of rebuilding his understanding of the world. Klaus felt sorry for Heinrich, but also grateful that he had chosen a different path. It would have been easier to cling to old hatreds, to blame others for Germany's destruction, to refuse to see the truth that sat in 2 empty Coca-Cola bottles on his sister's kitchen table. But easier was not the same as better. 6 months later, American relief workers arrived in their village with trucks full of supplies. Klaus was not surprised to see cases of Coca-Cola among the medical supplies and bags of flour. The Red Cross volunteers, Mostly women with kind faces and gentle hands set up tables in the ruins of the town square and began distributing food to anyone who needed it. Klaus watched from across the square as the children of his village had their first taste of the drink that had changed their uncle's understanding of the world. Their faces lit up with the same wonder he had seen in American prison camps. Their laughter rang out across the broken stones like music played on instruments of joy. One of the American volunteers, a woman about his sister's age with brown hair and tired eyes, approached Klaus as he stood watching. She spoke to him in careful, slow German. "You are Klaus Weber?" she asked. "Private Johnson wrote to our organization about you. He said you might be able to help us understand what your people need most." Klaus felt tears in his eyes at the mention of his friend's name. "Johnson wrote about me?" The woman smiled and pulled a letter from her jacket pocket. "He said you learned something important while you were with us. He said you could help us build bridges instead of walls." Klaus took the letter with shaking hands. In Johnson's careful handwriting, he read words that made his heart sing. "Klaus Weber is a good man who learned that kindness is stronger than hate. Help him help his people learn the same lesson. The world has had enough of walls. Time to build some bridges instead." As Klaus watched German children laugh and smile for the first time in years, sharing bottles of Coca-Cola with American soldiers who had once been their enemies, he understood the final lesson of the fizzy drink that had changed his life. It was never about the drink itself. It was about what the drink represented. A society so abundant that it could afford to make millions of bottles of happiness every single day. A people so confident in their way of life that they could share their treasures with their enemies. A nation so strong that it could win hearts along with battles, build hope along with victory. Klaus opened his own bottle, given to him by the kind American volunteer, and listened to the familiar hiss that now sounded like freedom, calling across an ocean of understanding. He had learned that true strength was not about how much you could destroy, but about how much you could create. Not about how much you could take, but about how much you could give. Not about how many people you could force to obey, but about how many people you could inspire to hope. The fizz on his tongue still tasted like hope made liquid, and in a world of ruins, hope was the most powerful weapon of all. It was the one weapon that could rebuild what war had destroyed and create something better than what had been lost. As the sun set over his broken village, Klaus Weber raised his bottle of Coca-Cola in a silent toast to Private Johnson, to Mrs. Patterson, to all the Americans who had taught him that enemies could become friends, and that the strongest people in the world were those who chose kindness over cruelty. The war was over. The real work of peace was just beginning, and it would be built one bottle, one act of kindness, one bridge of understanding at a time.